6 years after the battle, a Roman army came back to the place where it happened. It was 15 AD. The commander was Germanicus, the most admired general of his generation, and he marched his men deliberately to the spot to see it for themselves. What they found is described by the historian Tacitus, and it is one of the bleakest passages in Latin literature. Bones, scattered across the open ground where men had run and been cut down, or heaped where they had stood and fought to the last. Broken weapons, the bones of horses tangled with the bones of men, skulls nailed to the trunks of trees, and in the groves nearby, the altars, rough, makeshift things, where the tribunes and the senior centurions had been led and slaughtered as offerings to gods that were not Roman gods. Men who had lived through the disaster or through captivity after it had come back with the army. They walked the fields and pointed, here the legates had stood, here the eagles were taken, here Varus took the wound, and then took his own life. The soldiers gathered the bones and buried them. Tacitus says no one could tell whether he was covering the remains of a stranger or a brother. They built a single mound over all of it. 3 legions had marched into this forest, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. As legions, none of them marched out. Those numbers disappeared from the Roman legionary order after this disaster. Some did not raise another 17, 18, or 19 legion. To understand how the bones of an entire Roman field army came to lie scattered across a forest floor in northern Germany, we have to go back, not to the battle, to the assumption behind it. The assumption that this land was already won. I am Benito and welcome to the Jacked Historian channel, or Bene venistis ad canalem meum. It's Latin since we're talking about the Romans, and since as an Italian, our language, my language, is a far cousin of the Latin. As you may know, is part of the Romans' languages, since Latin is its own origin and opened up to make Spanish, Italian, French, Romanian, and Portuguese. They call them Romance languages. But let's go back to our story. What was the background and why did Rome look at Germania? By the time of Emperor Augustus, Rome had been the dominant power in the Mediterranean world for over a century. It had absorbed Greece, Egypt, Spain, and Gaul. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rhine twice, mostly to make a point. The point was Rome can go wherever it wants. Augustus wanted more than a point. He wanted a border that made sense. The Rhine was a usable frontier, but it was a long one, and the land beyond it was full of Germanic tribes who raided across it whenever it suited them. The logic in Rome was simple. Push the frontier forward, anchor it to the Alb and tie it to the Danube system, and you cut off the raiders' home ground and turn a problem into a province that pays taxes. So for roughly 2 decades before our battle, Rome pushed. Augustus' stepson did most of the work. Drusus campaigned deep into Germania in the years before his death in 9 BC. His brother Tiberius, the future emperor, followed up with several hard methodical campaigns. They built roads, they built forts along the rivers, they beat tribes in the field, took hostages, accepted submissions, installed garrisons. And then by the year 6 AD, the whole project nearly came apart somewhere else. A massive revolt broke out in Illyricum, across what the Romans called Pannonia and Dalmatia. in the Western Balkans, and it was serious enough that later Roman tradition remembered it as the hardest war Rome had fought since Hannibal. It pulled Tiberius and the bulk of Rome's strategic reserve south for 3 years of grinding warfare. While Rome's best general and its best troops were tied down putting out that fire, Germania was left to look after itself, managed less like an active war zone than like a province already settling into place. The revolt was finally crushed in the summer of 9 AD. By the early years of the 1st century AD, it looked done. That is the word to hold on to, looked. In the minds of Roman administrators, the land between the Rhine and the Alb was beginning to look like a province in the making. Tribes swore oaths. Young noblemen from those tribes were serving in the Roman army as officers. The way provincial elites everywhere served Rome. Trade goods moved along the rivers. The whole machinery of a new province seemed to be settling into place. Nobody in authority seems to have asked the obvious question. Submitting to a Roman army standing in your fields with your sons held as hostages is not the same thing as becoming a Roman. The tribes have stopped fighting. That is not the same as having been conquered. But Rome in the year 9 AD would no longer tell the difference, and it was about to send exactly the wrong man to find out. And here we have the first hints of the objectives. How did Rome turn a conquest into a province? The man Rome sent was Publius Quinctilius Varus. Varus was not a fool. It is worth saying that clearly at the start, because the story turns him into one. He was a senator, a former consul connected to the imperial family by marriage. He was experienced, trust, and this is the key thing, he was an administrator. His reputation had been made running provinces, not winning battles. Before Germania, he had governed Syria, a rich urbanized eastern province, long accustomed to kings, cities, taxes, courts, and imperial administration. Our main source for his career is a man named Publius Paterculus. Says he went into Syria a poor man and a rich province, and came out a rich man and a poor province. Make of that what you will, but make it carefully. Publius is the closest source we have to these events, and that is exactly what makes him dangerous. He served under Tiberius, admired him without reservation, and had every reason to pin the loss of Germania on one man. A good deal of the portrait of Varus the fool comes from someone who needed Varus to be the fool. So this was Varus's task. Germania, on paper, was conquered. His job was to do to it what Rome had done to Syria and Gaul and everywhere else. He installed the machinery of provincial government, taxes, Roman law, Roman courts, turn an occupied military zone into a functioning revenue-producing province. And Varus, by every account, set about it exactly as he would have in Syria. He held court, he held lawsuits between tribesmen and issued judgments under Roman law, he levied taxes. Sit with that picture for a second. A Roman governor deep in German forests, holding formal court sessions and expecting recently conquered warriors to bring him their property disputes and accept his rulings, as if they were shopkeepers in a Syrian town. The sources present this as Varus's central misjudgment, and it probably was. He treated the Germans as subjects who had already accepted their place. He was administering a province that did not yet exist to people who had not agreed to live in it. The objective wasn't wrong. Rome genuinely might have made Germania a province. It made plenty of harder places into provinces. The error was in the timing and in the assumption underneath it, that the work of conquest was finished when in fact it had barely been tested. Here is the strange thing about Teutoburg as a military disaster. On the Roman side, there was no battle plan because there was no expectation of battle. The Roman year in Germania ran on a routine. In the campaigning season, the army moved east to a summer camp, somewhere out toward the Weser River, in the heart of the territory Varus was administering. There, the governor did his governing. When the season ended and the weather turned, the army marched back west to its winter quarters on the Rhine at the great base of Vetera, modern Xanten. That was the rhythm. Out in spring, back in the fall. It had worked for years. So the plan in 9 AD was the same as every other year. Finish the season's business and march the army home for the winter. This is what makes the disaster so total. A general who expects a fight deploys for a fight. He scouts, he keeps his column tight, he chooses the ground. Varus was not marching to battle. He was marching home. With him moved not just 3 legions, but the entire apparatus of a traveling provincial government, baggage, supply wagons, servants, slaves, the families and camp followers that trailed every Roman army. A long, slow, comfortable column strung out for miles in a land it considered safe. The men who designed the actual plan that fall were on the other side. And they understood Varus's routine perfectly, because they were part of it. And here we see the first intelligence failures, the first cracks. Varus was warned. This is not hindsight. He was warned directly by name, before it happened, by a man who was pro-Roman, but not neutral, and he did nothing. The warning came from a Cheruscan nobleman named Segestus. The Cherusci were one of the major tribes in Varus's territory, and Segestus was firmly in the Roman camp. He told Varus more than once that a conspiracy was forming among the German nobility, and crucially he named the man at the center of it. That man was Arminius, a prince of the Cherusci, and this is the part Varus could not get past. One of his own most trusted officers. Segestus reportedly went further than a general warning. According to the sources, at a feast not long before the army marched, he told Varus to arrest a lot of them. Arrest Arminius, arrest the other German leaders, arrest Segestus himself if it will make Varus take it seriously, and sort the guilt out afterwards, lock them up, and the plot dies in its cradle. Varus refused. He refused because he trusted Arminius completely and because Segestus and Arminius were known rivals. And the rivalry was bitter and personal. Arminius had taken Segestus' daughter, Dasnelda, who had been promised to another man and married her against her father's will. So when Segestus warned Varus that Arminius was a traitor, he was also a father denouncing the son-in-law he never wanted. And Varus heard the warning and filed it as exactly what it looked like. One German nobleman trying to use a Roman governor to destroy a rival. It was a reasonable thing to think, but it was also, as it turned out, completely wrong. The warning was real, the rivalry was real, and both things were true at once. Varus saw the rivalry and used it to dismiss the warning. That is the intelligence failure in a single sentence. He found a reason not to believe the thing he did not want to believe. And then there was the trap underneath the trap. As the army was preparing for the long march home, word reached Varus of a small uprising, a disturbance among tribes some distance off his direct route. Nothing alarming, the kind of policing job a provincial governor handles without thinking. Varus decided to deal with it on the way home, swinging his line of march to pass through it. That decision took a column of 3 legions off the known prepared route and into unfamiliar country, which was the entire point. The uprising, the sources tell us, was staged. It was bait. And the man who had quietly encouraged Varus to believe it was safe to go that way was the same man Segestus had named. Put the pieces together and you can see the command failure forming before a single spear is thrown. Varus's first failure was not stupidity, it was interpretation. He read Germania as an administrative problem when it was still a military one. He had the instincts of a governor, not a soldier on hostile ground. A campaigning general moving through the forest he didn't control would have kept his column closed up, his scouts out, his pace disciplined. Varus moved like a man going home through friendly country, because he believed he was. His second failure was the column itself, stretched across a distance that different accounts estimate at several miles, interrupted by baggage and wagons and non-combatants, with the terrain forcing the line even narrower. An army in that formation cannot fight, it cannot form a line, cannot bring its numbers to bear, cannot do the one thing a Roman army was supremely good at, stand shoulder to shoulder and grind the enemy down in close formation. Forced into a single file among the trees, a legion was no longer a legion. It was a line of men. His third failure was trusting his guides, the local auxiliaries who knew the country, who advised the route, who rode alongside the column as friends, were Arminius's friends. At the chosen moment, they would peel away from the column on the pretext of gathering allied warriors to help suppress the very revolt they had invented. They rode off to raise the ambush. And then the weather turned. As northern German weather does in the fall, heavy rain, the tracks turned to mud. And then the weather turned. As northern German weather does in the fall, heavy rain. The tracks turned to mud. Shields grew waterlogged and heavy. Bowstrings on the few archers present went slack. The ground that a legionary needed to be firm underfoot became something that pulled at his boots. Everything that made a Roman legion terrifying in battle worked best with space, footing, formation, and visibility. Varus had almost none of them, not because the enemy got lucky. Arminius had chosen the time, the place, and the route. Varus had handed him each one, and then the weather made the trap worse. It is easy to tell Teutoburg as the story of a foolish Roman who lost an army. It is more accurate and more interesting to tell it as the story of a brilliant German who took one. Arminius was a prince of the Cherusci, probably around 25 years old in 9 AD, and he was not some forest chieftain Rome had never met. He was the opposite. He had been raised in part inside the Roman system. He had served as an officer commanding Cheruscan auxiliaries in the Roman army. He had Roman citizenship. He had been granted equestrian rank, the Roman knightly class. He knew Rome from the inside out. Its army, its methods, its assumptions, its overconfidence. He had stood in the Roman councils. He may well have eaten at Varus's table. This is what made him so dangerous, and it is the whole hinge of the disaster. Varus's fatal trust in Arminius was not stupidity. Arminius was, on paper, exactly the kind of loyal Romanized provincial nobleman the empire ran on. Varus trusted him for the same reason he should have been trustworthy. Arminius spent that trust like a weapon. His real achievement, the thing that should impress you even as a viewer rooting against him, was political, not military. He united the tribes. That sounds small. It was nearly impossible. The Germanic peoples were not a nation and did not think of themselves as one. They were dozens of separate tribes, often at each other's throats, with no tradition of combining under a single command. Rome had spent decades exploring exactly that, playing tribe against tribe, buying one to fight another. The reason Germania looked conquerable was that the Germans could never get out of their own way long enough to resist as one. The divisions ran right through Arminius's own house. Segestus, the man who tried to warn Varus, was a fellow Cheruscan nobleman who wanted Arminius arrested, and Arminius' own brother, a man the Romans called Flavus the Blonde, was at that moment serving loyally in the Roman army and will go on serving it for the rest of his life. One brother was about to destroy 3 Roman legions, the other had lost an eye fighting for Rome and would never turn against it. That is the world Arminius had to weld together, one where his own family could not agree which side to be on. Arminius got them out of their own way, quietly, over months. He built a coalition across tribal lines. Cherusci, Bructeri, and other tribes Rome had spent years trying to keep divided. And he did it under the nose of a Roman governor who was hosting him as an honored guest. That is the harder half of the whole operation. The ambush was the visible part. The coalition was the masterpiece, getting fractious, mutually hostile tribes to show up to the same ambush on the same day and hold their nerve until the signal. Then, the trap. Here the analysis stops and the battle begins. It did not happen all at once, it happened over days. The orderly sequence of events comes from Cassius Dio, writing nearly 2 centuries after the fact, so we should be careful not to treat every detail as precise chronology. But the broad shape of the disaster, a running ambush through forest, mud, and constricted ground, fits both the ancient sources and the archaeology behind it. Day 1. The column was deep in unfamiliar broken country, wooded ridges on one side, soft and marshy ground on the other. The track narrowing between them. The rain was already falling. The army was forced into a long column through the trees, slowed by its baggage, by fallen trees, by mud. The German auxiliaries had already gone. They had ridden off ahead, with Varus's blessing to raise help. Then the attack came, not as a battle line. The Germans had no interest in standing toe-to-toe with legionaries, and they knew better than to try. It came from the wooded high ground, a rain of spears and javelins crashing down into the flank of a column that could not turn, could not form up, and could not close with an enemy that struck and vanished back into the trees. The Romans took their losses and kept moving, because moving was the only option. They fought their way to firmer, more open ground and did what disciplined Romans did under pressure. They made a camp, ditch, rampart, order out of chaos. They had been bloodied, they were not yet broken. Day 2. They broke camp and marched on, and the country grew worse. To move at all, Varus ordered much of the baggage burned. The wagons, the comforts of the traveling province, all the things that marked this as a march home rather than a fighting retreat. It was an admission. This was now a struggle for survival. For a time the ground opened and the attacks eased. There may even have been a moment when escape seemed possible. Then the column was forced back into the trees and swamps, and the attacks returned with greater force. The Germans were not tiring. They were gathering strength. Every tribe Arminius had spent months persuading was arriving now, drawn by the smell of Roman defeat. Day 3. The decisive ground, or at least one major killing ground, is almost certainly the place modern archaeologists call Kalkriese, near Osnabrück. At Kalkriese, the ground did the Germans' work for them. A wooded hill on one side, wet, impassable, marshes on the other. Between them a corridor narrowing to a bottleneck, and along the foot of the hill the Germans had built a turf and earth rampart in advance, turning the gap between slope and the marshes into a prepared killing ground. They had built it before the Romans ever arrived. The column, exhausted, soaked, and bleeding from 2 waves of attrition, was forced into the gap. The rampart broke its momentum from behind it and from the wooded slope above. The Germans hurled their javelins and then came on in a rush, crashing into the flank of a packed Roman mass that it could neither form a line nor run. The column came apart. Numonius Valla, one of Varus's senior officers, made the choice men make when discipline finally breaks. He took the cavalry and tried to ride for the Rhine, leaving the infantry behind. It did not save him. The Germans ran the horsemen down and Valla died in flight. Others chose differently. One legate, Aegius, is remembered for dying at the head of his men. Another, Seonius, surrendered, hoping for a mercy that was not coming. By the end, there was no good choice left. There were only different ways to die. Varus, wounded, trapped, and watching his army die around him, did what a defeated Roman commander was expected to do. He fell on his own sword. Several of his senior officers killed themselves with him. It did not stop the killing. The leaderless remainder was hunted down through the forest. Some men were taken alive, and for most of them, capture was the worst fate. These were the prisoners led into the sacred groves and killed on the altars Germanicus's men would find 6 years later. The senior officers offered to the gods, the rest cut down, enslaved, or left where they fell. 3 legions, 3 cavalry wings, 6 cohorts of auxiliaries, plus the wagons, the servants, the families, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 fighting men, and we do not know how many others. Almost none of them returned. What did all of this cost? What was the reckoning? The news reached Rome and broke the most powerful man in the world. Augustus, by then an old man who had brought peace to a Roman world exhausted by civil war, reportedly came apart. Suetonius says he let his hair and beard grow for months, that he struck his head against a door, and that he was heard crying out, "Quintili, vare, legiones redde, Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Strip away the theater and the strategic verdict remains real and permanent. Rome had lost something like 1/10 of its legions in a matter of days, in a single place to an enemy it had written off as already beaten. The fear in Rome was real. Suetonius says Augustus posted night watches through the city to prevent unrest and kept provincial governors in place beyond their terms, so the frontiers remained in experienced hands. The dread was the tribes might pour across the Rhine into Gaul and from Gaul toward Italy. They did not. Arminius had no interest in marching on Rome and probably no means to do it. But Rome did not know that yet. For a time, the most powerful city on earth braced for an invasion that was never coming. The disaster acquired a name Romans would use for generation: Clades Variana, the Varian disaster. And here is the detail that makes it almost cruel. The Illyrian revolt, the 3-year war that had tied down Tiberius and Rome's reserves, had only just been won. By one account, the dispatch announcing that victory and the dispatch announcing Varus's annihilation reached Rome within 5 days of each other. The city had barely finished celebrating the end of one disaster before it learned of the next. And it never really went back. There were reprisals, Tiberius restored the frontier, Germanicus led hard punitive campaigns across the Rhine in 14 and 16 AD. He defeated Arminius in the field, recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagles, one of them through his officer Stertinius, and buried the dead at the battle site. The 3rd eagle came back decades later under Claudius. On the surface, honor had been restored. Those campaigns also swept up the human wreckage of the feud Varus had dismissed. Segestus, besieged by Arminius' faction, was rescued by the Romans and handed them his own daughter. Thusnelda was pregnant with Arminius' child when she was taken. She was carried to Rome and paraded through the streets in Germanicus' triumph. And she bore her son, raised in Italy far from his father's world. The quarrel Varus had treated as one nobleman's grievance was real after all, and its consequences outlived the battlefield. The brothers faced each other again too, with a river between them. With two armies facing each other, Arminius and Flavius are said to have argued across the water, one shouting to the other about Roman honors and Roman pay, the other of homeland and freedom, until they had to be held back from getting at each other with their horses throughout the water. Two brothers, one river, two loyalties, and neither moved the other an inch. But the larger ambition, Germania as a Roman province, the frontier on the Alb, was finished. Germanicus was recalled, the Rhine remained the empire's main northern frontier. Rome would still raid across it, punish, trade, recruit, and at times hold ground beyond it. For a period it held the Agri Decumates, a strategic piece of territory across the Black Forest between the Upper Rhine and the Danube. But the project of a province reaching to the Alb was dead. The legion numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never reissued, as if the army itself wanted no reminder. It is one of the rare battles that can honestly be called a turning point without exaggeration. A different result in that forest and the Roman frontier might have run along the Alb, but the later history of Central Europe, the line between a Romanized West and a non-Roman Germanic world might have fallen somewhere else entirely. A huge part of Europe's later shape pivots, in part on what happened during those rainy days in the marshes and forests of Germania. As for Arminius, he won the greatest victory any Germanic leader ever won against Rome, and it did not save him. He could unite the tribes against an invader. He could not hold them together once the invader withdrew. The same independence that made the Germans impossible for Rome to govern made them impossible for Arminius to rule. Within roughly a decade, he was dead, killed by, the sources say, not by Romans, but by members of his own family and tribe who feared he was reaching for the kinship German nobles would not tolerate. Tacitus, a Roman, gives him a remarkable epitaph: Liberator haud dubie, Germania. Without doubt, the liberator of Germania. And then a long silence, because here the story turns away from 9 AD and toward us. For most of the next millennium and a half, Arminius was essentially forgotten in his own homeland. He survived because a Roman wrote him down. When Tacitus' work resurfaced in Europe in the 15th century, Germans rediscovered, in the words of their old enemy, a native hero who had thrown out the most powerful empire on earth. He was given a German name, Hermann, and over the following centuries was rebuilt into a symbol of German unity and resistance, culminating in the 19th century with an enormous monument raised in his honor. Most of that myth-making belongs to the Romantic and Nationalist age, especially the decades around German unification. And eventually, Nazi-era racial ideology inherited it and twisted it into something poisonous, a myth of an eternal German nation defending blood and soil against outsiders. It is worth saying plainly that this is a back projection. The real Arminius was a Roman-trained Roman citizen cavalry officer leading a fragile temporary coalition of tribes who had no concept of a German nation and who killed him when he looked too powerful. The man and the myth have almost nothing in common. The honest thing a historian can do is keep them apart. What remains when the myth is stripped away is a simpler and harder lesson. Rome did not lose 3 legions because the Germans were unbeatable. Rome lost them because he had decided the war was already over. It mistook the absence of fighting for the presence of victory. It sent an administrator to govern a peace that had not actually been made, and he trusted the one man best placed to betray it. The forest did not kill those legions. The assumption did. Teutoburg is what happens when Rome mistakes confidence for control. Next time, that same confidence moves east, out of the forests and into the desert, against an enemy that does not ambush from the trees, but circles in the open and never closes the range. A Roman general rich beyond reason and hungry for the glory the other 2 great men of his generation already have. A Roman general rich beyond reason and hungry for the glory the other 2 great men of his generation already have marches an army into Parthia, chasing a war nobody needs. Well, this is the end for this episode. Thank you very much for following up and sticking out until the end. Gratias ago quod usque ad finem mansistis, mox vos videbo.